the Pluto case, very interesting. The way objective truths work is if it's scientifically established by the methods and tools that I'm describing, then it's not later shown to be false.
Okay.
What happens is, often, this objective truth is only a part of a larger truth, but it doesn't end up getting overturned if it had been established experimentally and observationally in the ways that I had described.
Yeah.
So, what's an example? We found Pluto in the discoverer, Clyde Tombaugh, in 1930. We suspected there was a planet out there because the movement of Neptune was not following Newton's laws. Neptune was the then farthest planet, so maybe there's something tugging on it. Neptune was discovered that way. There is Uranus. Say, Herschel discovered a new planet. It was great. Oh, by the way, an aside, he named it after the king initially, King George, the King George of the American Revolution, right? And just because, why not? I mean, you get in, you want to stroke the king, right? Okay.
Right. Good idea.
So
by the way, probably get some more funding.
That's what I'm saying.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Which is something I want to get to in just a moment.
Yes. So I have textbooks from about a 30-year period that enumerate the planets, and it's Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and George. So clearer heads would ultimately prevail. Oh, they're Roman gods. Let's do this right. Point is, we already knew what effect an unseen planet's gravity can have. So let's look. We looked in places it should have been, nobody found it. And so we just conducted a systematic survey of the entire sky, and Clyde Tombaugh discovers Pluto. Not where we thought it should have been to affect Neptune, but it was headline news.
Yeah.
All right. As time went on, we found it's not as big as it should be to do what we think it needs to do. And it's really kind of puny. And as the decades proceeded, it was fading from the headline of what it was discovered to be.
Right.
When we finally settled on what the size was, because every next measurement was an improvement on the previous one, it turned out like our moon is 5 times the mass of Pluto. Oh my gosh.
Right.
So the mistake was the enthusiasm that we discovered the planet that was affecting Neptune. We learned that it was not very quickly, but we still wanted it. Plus, that's the same year. This is a complete aside for your show here. That same year is when Disney introduced Pluto the dog. And once you do that, come on, you got the endearing, we got a cartoon character.
Makes it a lot harder to make this
It makes it a lot harder.
Population.
You can't.
Right.
You can't shake it at that point. You can't. You got a dog, a beloved dog.
Right.
All right. The point is, Pluto we discovered. Then in the 1990s we discovered icy bodies in the outer solar system that rivaled Pluto in size. And we said, hey, and then we found many of them. And so what we concluded was Pluto wasn't so much the 9th planet, it was one of the largest of the icy bodies of a new swath of real estate that we added to our understanding of the solar system, called the Kuiper Belt of comets. So we still had the basic solar system. Pluto was always a bit controversial, but we've now grown in our larger understanding.
Was there anybody in science sort of pushing back, saying this is a waste of time, or leave Pluto alone? I mean, was there?
Oh yeah, of course.
That going
there's
on?
always that. The people who were sort of invested in it, and I wrote a book on this called The Pluto Files: The Rise and Fall of America's Favorite Planet. And the arguments given for it just came and went. Right? Pluto had a moon. So it's got a moon. It's got to be a planet. It's a good old red-blooded planet. It's got a moon, Moon Charon, right? And shortly after that, we discovered much smaller asteroids that had moons. So you couldn't invoke that anymore. And every excuse to try to clutch to what it once was ended up evaporating away. And so ultimately the International Astronomical Union, which has as their duty to establish nomenclature and categories and things based on the emergent understandings of the world, said we have a new definition of a planet. And Pluto is now a dwarf planet. It's still a planet, just a dwarf planet. I think it's happier that way. It's,
Okay,
it's one of the biggest of the ice bodies.
It stands out, you know,
rather than a puny
it's
planet.
living its space alone.
Exactly.
You know? Yeah, it's great. It's cool.
Exactly.
Right.
But the bigger story here, that's just one example of it. If we take Newton's laws of motion and gravity, it got us to the moon, Newton's laws. We learned that at very high speeds and at very strong gravities, Newton's laws fail.
Right.
They just fail. What's going on? So do you say, let's throw out the entire Newton's laws? Do you do that, or do you say, well, what's actually happening? Because his laws were, he never saw anything run faster than a horse.
Well, but certainly there's got to be a point, and whether Newton's laws have made it, where you do realize that it was a series of assumptions that were not as strong as we thought, and we do throw them out.
No, yeah, but assumptions are, you don't need assumptions when you have experimental evidence to support.
Right.
Assumptions are gone, right?
So assumptions should be no part of science.
But, well, no, they get you started.
Okay, got it.
Because I'm going to assume this is true, let me test it.
Right.
Well, nothing wrong with assumptions.
Okay.
But once something's established, there are no assumptions. It just is.
Right.
Okay, equals MC squared involves no assumptions at all. Okay, that's what enables bombs, all right? And nuclear energy of all stripes. So the point is, Einstein discovers a law of gravity and a law of motion that does not have these problems with it. And it's called the theory of relativity. It applies in extreme gravity and extreme accelerations and motions. And the only reason why I'm telling you this is, so do you throw Newton's laws out? No. If you put low speeds and low gravity into Einstein's equations, they become Newton's equations. So Newton's equations, we would later learn, are a subset of a much larger objective truth of the universe.
True in the micro contained space it's looking at doesn't hold.
Correct.
As we back out our perspective.
Correct. And the methods and tools of science have been invoked basically in the way we now know them since about 1600. You could go before then and find everyone agreeing that something is true and finding out it's complete opposite, like Earth in the center of the known universe, and then it's the sun.
Right.
Okay?
So I want to.
That's before
let me interject.
We have these tools.
And this is based on a statement you've made a lot in media that I want to sort of get into in this space.
I think we're in the middle of a massive experiment worldwide. The experiment is, will people listen to scientists? In this case, referring to medical professionals? In this particular case?
Say Anthony Fauci over allergy and infectious disease.
For example?
It's an experiment in whether people will listen to scientists.
That's what it is.
That's what this is.
What do you have to do to get to the point where you can believe what the scientist says and not the person who wishfully thinks something is different?
So I want to get into this because, you know, everything, I totally agree with everything you're saying. My question comes into the space where, as you're saying, you know, you have a guy naming a planet for a king. I think that there's for a reason. I get funding if I can inspire you to care about what I'm doing. You talked about...
But we undid that.
Well, right. It gets undone. Obviously,
Clearer
it
Head
gets
said,
undone.
no, you're not naming this after your freaking king.
We also see, as you described, you know, the headline goes to the one scientist that has some breakout thing, and then media isn't honest about the fact that it's just... It may be an anomaly. It needs to be challenged, and we really shouldn't take it just at face value. There's a lot more that needs to be done. But my question is, and you sort of stated this, but it's this problem with bias. That the problem I see in many ways, especially in the modern world, with the amount of funding needed to do the levels of science that we're now doing, right? It's very expensive to be getting out into the cosmos now and looking at ice, particles, or are they dwarf planet, all of this. And so that headline actually helps that scientist get more funding. And the people around that scientist like that it got that headline because it also brings attention to the fact that they're involved with this funding. And so what we're developing is this, really this sort of cyclone that happens around a brand new idea, whether it has value or not. And we have scientists, I think, that are being affected by the gravity of things that are rotating around it. How does science free itself from that bias in order to ask itself, or a scientist to ask themselves, or allow others to ask them the appropriate questions so that we can get to the bottom of whether or not that is true. And does science, scientists have a bias, do they not?
So, a very important point to raise here. So, and let me unpack what you said. There's like 3 separate questions in there. So, one of them is the attention a scientist might get in a media headline. That works maybe for their grandmother, okay? Grandmother says, hey, that's my boy, you know, grandparents. For the funding agency, they're much less influenced by what the media says of your work than you implied in your comment.
Okay.
Okay? The funding agency, typically funding occurs through peer review. You have a proposal for what you want to study.
Right.
And then it goes to peer review. And people say, well, no, this is kind of fringy. And someone else attempted it and failed. Why they think they're going to succeed in this way? So I would claim that we are not as susceptible as a community to media headlines as the public is. Now, by the way...
But universities, I mean, universities, like they have star quarterbacks, don't mind seeing their name in the New York Times. They love it, right? So they are going to benefit those
for fundraising,
you know, all of that.
They'll put it in their newsletter.
So they have. I mean, they're the ones that are housing the scientists. Certainly,
yes,
how big is your lab and what are things you're getting? You're a superstar. Those headlines matter to that university.
Yes, they do, and the university will lead with those headlines.
Right.
For sure. For sure.
So then that's. I didn't put that in there, but there's an orbiting pressure on the science that's happening.
Right, but at the end of the day, the money is coming from unless you privately raise the money, then you get it from other human beings who are like, not necessarily venture capitalists, but people who are rich sympathizers to the science you're interested in. They could end up funding it.
Right.
And then you'll get extra funding.